Hey everyone, I know it's been a minute since I made a new video, but here we are. I want to give you a heads up that if you're afraid of snakes, you might not want to watch this and you might want to skip this video. I'm in fact terrified of snakes, and I have been ever since I can remember, and I'm not entirely sure why. So making this video and doing the research for that made me cringe and want to curl up into a ball, but it also fascinated me at the same time. Today we're talking about Glenn Summerford. Before we get into Glenn's story, we need to take a history lesson on snake handling practices in church. A man by the name of George Went Hensley is often credited with introducing snake handling practices into the Church of God Holiness around 1910. He later traveled to the southeast promoting the practice, and eventually he left his ministry to start the first holiness movement church to require snake handling as evidence of salvation. If believers truly had the Holy Spirit within them, Hensley said, they should be able to handle rattlesnakes and any number of other venomous serpents. Snakes are only considered serpents if they are venomous, like rattlesnakes, copperheads, and cottonmouths. They also should be able to drink poison and suffer no harm whatsoever. This belief came from the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Luke in the Bible. In Mark chapter 16, verse 17 to 18, it reads, "And these signs shall follow them that believe. In my name shall they cast out devils. They shall speak with new tongues. They shall take serpents. And if they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them. They shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover." In Luke chapter 10, verse 19, it reads, "Behold, I give unto you power to tread on serpents and scorpions, and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall by any means hurt you." Snake handling as a test or denomination of faith became popular wherever Hensley traveled and preached in small towns of Tennessee, Kentucky, the Carolinas, Virginia, Ohio, and Indiana. Sister churches later sprang up throughout the Appalachian region, and ironically, in July of 1955, Hensley died following a snake bite received during a service he was conducting in Florida. Most religious snake handlers are still found in the Appalachian Mountains and other parts of the southeastern United States, especially in Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Kentucky, North Carolina, Tennessee, West Virginia, and South Carolina. However, all Appalachian states have outlawed snake handling rituals, with the exception of West Virginia because their state constitution doesn't allow for any law to impede upon a religious practice. Churchgoers hold snakes, sing with the snakes in their hands, and dance with the snakes in their hands during services. Churchgoers are not forced to pick up the snakes, but are encouraged to do so if they want to, and children aren't allowed to touch them until they're an adult. But if you believe in the Holy Spirit and the gospel, then you won't be bitten. And if you are bitten and you die, then that's what God's plan was for you. Churchgoers refuse medical care if they're bitten. Some people have gotten sick from being bitten, but were ultimately fine, but others have actually died from being bitten. So getting back to Glenn Summerford. Glenn lived in Scottsboro, Alabama, and he had some run-ins with the law, but after this he decided to create the Church of Jesus with Signs Following, which is a strange name, and he was the preacher of the church. His church practiced snake handling as part of their theology. Glenn was married to Darlene Summerford, who was also a snake handler with Glenn at the church. The couple had only been bitten a couple of times, and each time they did not seek medical treatment. So they were really well liked in the church and seen as holy, no pun intended. Before they met each other, Darlene gave birth to her first son when she was 18, but ended up giving him up for adoption because she couldn't care for him. Not long after this is when Glenn and Darlene met, and the two got married when Darlene was 20 years old. They had a son 3 years after they got married named Marty. As time went on, Darlene became annoyed with Glenn. He was extremely controlling and had a drinking problem. He wouldn't let Darlene out of his sight, and when she did leave the house, Glenn sent Marty with her to watch her and see what she was doing, and Marty would tell his mom what not to do, per Glenn. By 1991, when Darlene was 36 years old, she wanted a divorce from Glenn, who was at the time 47 years old. She was tired of Glenn being controlling, and she was fed up with him being drunk all the time. She was over it. But Glenn wasn't having it, and threatened to take Marty away from her and never let her see her son again. And he did this because he knew that Darlene had given her first son away, and she felt pain from losing him, and she didn't want to lose Marty too. Unfortunately, Darlene took this threat seriously and didn't have the resources to fight this, and she became scared. Around this time, Glenn started accusing Darlene of running around with other men, specifically another preacher. Glenn confronted Darlene and asked if she was sleeping around, and she said, "No, But Glenn didn't believe her, surprise, surprise, and started pretending to make phone calls to this other preacher and pretended that this man was telling Glenn that she was cheating. But Darlene didn't fall for this and knew that he was lying and called him out on his lies. Moving on, Glenn kept venomous snakes in the shed in the backyard in boxes for his church services. At the time, they had 22 snakes, which consisted of rattlesnakes, copperheads, and cottonmouths. Most of the snakes were caught in the wild around the mountains where the Summerfords lived and where the church was located, because a lot of venomous snakes are native to that area. Sometimes the snakes were caught right before church services, because when the snakes were kept in boxes in captivity, they can become lethargic and sick, and just not as active as snakes that are in the wild. Well, on October 4th, 1991, Glenn was drunk, which was a common occurrence, and he took Darlene to the shed with a gun to her head. He told Darlene to stick either her hand or her head in one of the snake boxes or he was going to kill her. That escalated quickly. Darlene really had no choice. It was either get bit or get shot, so she stuck her left hand into one of the boxes and she got bit on her thumb. After a few hours, Darlene started to become really sick, and wanted Glenn to take her to the hospital, but he refused to take her. Once the venom gets into your system, it can cause death pretty quick if left untreated. It can cause cardiac arrest, amongst other things, which isn't good. And depending on if the person has any underlying medical conditions, such as diabetes or hypertension or whatever, it will also play a factor into someone's survival rate. So anyway, after begging and begging, Glenn finally agreed to take Darlene to the hospital, and he put her in the car. But instead of taking her straight to the hospital, he decided to run some errands. He went to the grocery store, and the liquor store, and the video store. Mind you, this whole time Darlene is a hostage. After a few hours of doing this, they finally came home, and Darlene was feeling really, really sick. And Darlene questioned Glenn as to why he hadn't taken her to the hospital, and he said he never agreed to do that. He then told Darlene if she wrote 2 notes, he would take her to the hospital. The first note Glenn wanted her to write was to her sister. In the note, Glenn wanted Darlene to explain to her sister that Darlene ran away with her sister's husband, who was also Glenn's half-brother. Obviously, this wasn't true, but moving on. The next note Darlene had to write was to their son, Marty. Glenn told her exactly what to write, and in this case, it was a suicide note, explaining how she was miserable with the marriage, she couldn't fix it, and didn't know what to do. Both of these notes didn't make any sense. Eventually, Darlene fell asleep, and when she woke up, it was 5 a.m. Glenn told her that she was going to die at 6 a.m. He grabbed Darlene by the hair and stuck a gun up against her back and led her to the shed again and said, "You better pray you got things right because you're going to die. You can kind of see where this is going." So they go back again into the shed, but this time Glenn grabbed either a pipe or a bat and started hitting one of the snake boxes. One of the big rattlesnakes started getting really agitated and recoiled like he was getting ready to strike. Like the first time Glenn told her, again, she either had to stick her head or her hand in the snake box, and again, like the first time, Darlene stuck her left hand in the box, and this time she got bit on the back of her hand. Now Darlene had twice the amount of venom in her system, and she immediately started feeling terrible. Eventually, Glenn allowed her to come back inside the house, but she really struggled getting to the house. She could barely walk, and she was falling over, and she was unable to get back up. And no, Glenn didn't try to help her. She finally makes it inside and asks Glenn for water because she was super thirsty and was constantly puking. She wanted a bucket so she could throw up in the bucket instead of on the floor, since she couldn't make it to the bathroom, but Glenn refused to help her. Darlene was able to somehow get to the couch and laid down, but she constantly had to roll over halfway off the couch to puke off the floor while also having diarrhea at the same time. She literally had no control over her bowels from the venom. Good old Glenn came and decided to lay across from his sick wife and watched her and told her, "If you move, I'll blow your brains out." Darlene stayed still, and eventually Glenn either passed out or because he was drunk or he fell asleep, and Darlene noticed that their landline was unplugged and near Glenn. So she took this opportunity and used all of her strength to crawl over to the phone without waking Glenn up. Crawl to the kitchen, get a glass of water, and plug the phone into the landline and call her sister. How she did this without waking Glenn is incredible. Anyway, she called her sister, who then called the ambulance. Darlene somehow made it outside and waited for the ambulance to pick her up. She told the EMTs that her husband had taken her hostage and that she had 2 snake bites, which they could see. The first bite on her thumb was starting to get necrotic, meaning the tissue was dying and turning black. The more recent bite was red and puffy. The ambulance took her to Jackson County Hospital, and from there she was transferred via ambulance to the UBA, the University of Alabama Birmingham Hospital. Based on what I've learned, most hospitals in Alabama can handle snake bites because they have the antivenom that they need to treat the bites, but the worst of the worst get sent to the UBA because they are more equipped to handle more serious cases. Darlene was there for a few days, and then she was discharged. She went for a follow-up with the doctor, and she was told she needed more surgery to remove more tissue from her hand. Glenn was arrested shortly after the incident, and his case went to trial. At trial, there was a bunch of testimony from family, friends, the responding EMTs, the owner of the video store who had cameras set up, the owner of the liquor store who also had cameras set up, and they all validated the days leading up to and the day that Glenn tried to kill Darlene with snakes. Animal Control also testified and said of the 22 snakes on the property, 17 of them were venomous. Anyway, after Darlene's testimony, a member of the church, 23-year-old Tammy Flippo, claimed that Darlene called her and confessed that she tried to kill Glenn with snakes and that she accidentally got bitten twice. But there's no way to prove this claim. Tammy also claimed she didn't have a relationship with Glenn, but it was later proven that she had stayed at his house for several nights. Despite this weak defense, the jury still thought the case was he said, she said, until they heard the notes that Glenn forced Darlene to write. The notes didn't make any sense, and after hearing them, they were convinced that Glenn was guilty. In February 1992, Glenn was found guilty and sentenced for 99 years due to mandatory minimums because he had 2 prior felony convictions. He is serving his sentence in the Alabama State Penitentiary. He's also serving a separate 30-year sentence because back in 2004, he tried to escape jail when he was on a work detail. He was caught 45 minutes after his attempted escape. His most recent parole was denied, and his minimum release date is February 4th, 2121. This case is very interesting for a few different reasons. For one, the fact that Darlene survived after being bitten twice by venomous snakes is pretty impressive. I mean, it's possible she had built up some tolerance because she had been bitten in the past without seeking medical attention. It's surprising that she didn't die from the bites, but anyway. Another thing that's really interesting is that Glenn attempted to kill Darlene with the snakes because he, get this, wanted to marry another woman. Ironic, because he got mad when Darlene wanted a divorce. But I guess since it was his idea that he wanted to marry another woman, it was somehow okay? What a hypocrite. And was the woman he wanted to marry Tammy? Possible. She's the one who claimed Darlene confessed to her for trying to murder Glenn. I find it highly possible. And many of the people at the church didn't think Glenn was guilty because of either the religious beliefs about the snakes or maybe because Tammy was feeding them lies the whole time. Who knows? It's all very interesting. Anyway, if you like this case and you want to know more, you can check out the documentary Alabama Snake on HBO Max, which goes into more detail than I did. But I'd like to know your thoughts in the comments down below. As always, thanks for watching. If you enjoy this kind of content, please consider subscribing. If you have any suggestions, cases, or stories you would like me to cover, please feel free to leave a comment down below. And as always, stay safe.